So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome to tonight's birthday lecture, or belated birthday lecture. We actually celebrated, obviously, the birthday, 131st birthday on Saturday. We had some cake and so on, but we have some more birthday cake after this lecture. We'll have some wine and things like that as well, and we might be able to compel Noel O'Grady, who's here in the audience, to maybe sing a song or two as well. So tonight's speaker is Associate Professor of English at Trinity College Dublin. He has co-edited 5 volumes to date on Joyce, amongst them How Joyce Wrote Finnegans Wake, which was also edited with Luca Crispi. He has also edited the book Renaissance Joyce, which was just published this month by University of Florida Press, as well as the forthcoming Derrida and Joyce, which will be published in May by SUNY Press. Last year he edited and annotated a reprint of the 1939 Odyssey Press edition of Ulysses, which is published by Alma Classics. We have it down in the bookshop. It's a very nice edition. The annotations are excellent, so I would encourage you to pick one up if you haven't taken a look at it yet. In addition to that, he's a trustee of the International James Joyce Foundation and a co-director of the Samuel Beckett Summer School, which is held at Trinity College in July each year. So it's my great pleasure to welcome tonight Sam Slote.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for inviting me. Since I'm somewhat literal-minded, when Mark asked me to give the birthday lecture, I figured I should talk about birthdays in and around Joyce. And so to begin, I would like to welcome you all to the year 131, Annus Joycius, which also happens to be, coincidentally, 2013. Birthdays are a curious ritual since they mark the link between our own personal calendars and chronologies and the more public calendars shared by everyone else. Or, if you're astrologically inclined, birthdays indicate our connection to the cosmos at large. But the astrology business is, of course, silly. But the idea of having the date of our birth connect us to larger forces is an interesting one. These larger forces that our birthdays connect us to might not be metaphysical, but rather would be the product of human engineering and ingenuity. A certain degree of technology and standardization is needed to conduct the ritual of birthdays, namely accurate calendars and a coordinated and shared reference. By linking our personal calendar, that is the calendar that starts with our own individual birth, to the common shared calendar, birthdays are parachronistic, a word that I have not invented, and a word that, according to the OED, has come to be synonymous with anachronistic, but which more properly means 2 or more chronologies side by side. All birthdays are parachronistic because no birthday is singular. February 2nd, to take an example, is other things as well, Candlemas and, of course, Groundhog Day. Candlemas, the feast of the presentation of Christ in the temple, links Christ to the strictures of Judaism and the Jewish calendar since, according to Mosaic law, a mother must present a male child 40 days after his birth for a ritual cleansing in the temple. And so Candlemas is parachronistic in that it links a Jewish chronology to the Christian calendar of holy days. Other parachronisms around February 2nd are less fortuitous. It pains me to say this, but Joyce shares his birthday with Ayn Rand. This year's February 2nd also marks the centennial of Grand Central Station in New York, and a grand station it is. And so February 2nd can be many things to many people, but to us here in this room, it is primarily just the one thing. But of course, we're not here exactly on Joyce's birthday, but 2 days later. This is entirely appropriate because, as I'll try to explain, Joycean birthdays are not necessarily fixed and are eminently malleable and adaptable. Joycean birthdays are movable feasts. Within the Joycean calendar, Bloomsday looms large, and not just in Dublin. On the other hand, within Joyce's own personal calendar, his birthday was arguably the more important date. Of course, lest we forget, Bloomsday is also the birthday of Mortimer Purefoy, who we celebrate every year. And Bloomsday is perhaps another birthday for Joyce himself because of what happened with Nora on that day in 1904. As part of Joyce's scrupulous verisimilitude and attention to local color, he made sure that Ulysses incorporated all manner of details from June 16, 1904. He thus commemorates his first date with Nora by representing June 16th from a variety of different perspectives. Many events from June 16th find their way into Ulysses, such as Throwaway's spectacular victory at the Gold Cup race and the bicycle races at Trinity. Even very small details are present. At the start of Ithaca, when Bloom and Stephen are walking to Eccles Street, one of the topics of their conversation is the influence of gaslight or the light of arc and glow lamps on the growth of adjoining paraheliotropic trees. A story in the 16th of June Evening Telegraph, which Bloom had perused in the cabman's shelter in Emmaus, reported an experiment that showed that plants grow more rapidly under electric light. So this is an entirely plausible conversation to have had in Dublin late at night on June 16, 1904. However, there are many anachronisms in Ulysses, references that post-date 1904. Fans of scrupulous verisimilitude might be disappointed to learn that, contrary to the events of Wandering Rocks, the Myris Bazaar was not opened on June 16th, but rather on May 31st, and, furthermore, William Humble Lord, the Lord Lieutenant, did not arrive at the bazaar in a grand cavalcade through the city centre, but rather he came there more modestly from the south. Likewise, Joseph Patrick Nanetti was not in Dublin on June 16th, but in London, speaking in Parliament to question the ban on the playing of Irish sports in the Phoenix Park. Joyce moves this event to the following day. Likewise, the newspaper story Alf Bergen reads in Cyclops, Black Beast Burned in Omaha, Georgia, was not a story from 1904, but rather from 1919 when Joyce was writing this episode. On September 30th, 1919, the London Times reported on the lynching of a black man in Omaha, Nebraska, but the Times incorrectly called it Omaha, Georgia, which it does exist. There are a number of analogous references in Ulysses, allusions to events contemporaneous with the writing of Ulysses, but not with when it takes place. But perhaps the most troubling anachronism in Ulysses is the reference to Julius Pokerny's claim that there is no trace of hell in Irish myth. Pokerny did make such a claim, but it was only published in book form in 1923, 1 year after Ulysses was published. Indeed, in 1904, Pokerny was just a teenager and not yet a scholar of Irish myth. So how could Joyce have incorporated a reference to a book that postdates Ulysses unless he had access to some kind of TARDIS? In the 1960s, Fritz Senn tracked down Pokerny and asked him for some clarification. While Pokerny never met Joyce, he pointed out that he had been in Dublin in 1912 at the same time as Joyce's final visit here. And so perhaps Joyce attended one of Pokerny's public lectures here or heard about them from somewhere else. In any case, the mixture of accurate historical reference and the anachronistic makes Ulysses parachronistic, a palimpsest of different chronologies combined and conflated. In terms of commemorating his birthday, Joyce arranged to have both Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake published on February 2nd, although, as I'll get to in a moment, the actual dates for publication for each book are a little bit slippery. On November 1st, 1921, shortly before Ulysses was published, Joyce wrote to Weaver, Harriet Shaw Weaver, his patron, to explain the role of birthdays in his publications. A coincidence is that of birthdays in connection with my books. A Portrait of the Artist, which first appeared serially in your paper on the 2nd of February, finished on 1 September, which was Weaver's birthday. Ulysses, begun on 1 March, the birthday of a friend of mine, a Cornish painter, Frank Budgeon, and was finished on Mr. Pound's birthday, October 30th. October 30th, he tells me. I wonder on whose it will be published. Birthdays and publication dates are parachronistic for Joyce. Joyce is entirely correct about A Portrait, which was first serialized in the New Free Woman, which is the precursor to The Egoist, on Joyce's birthday in 1915. But the other dates that he gives here are a little bit more ambiguous. At present, it is impossible to substantiate or refute his claim about having begun Ulysses on March 1st, or for that matter, on any other date. With Finnegan's Wake, there is clear documentary evidence for its inception, but the same is not the case with Ulysses. So the March 1st date could really just be made up. And Joyce's claim that he had finished Ulysses on October 30th, just 2 days before he wrote this letter, isn't entirely accurate. This would be another example of Joyce twisting facts to suit his purposes. On the day he had supposedly finished writing Ulysses, October 30th, he wrote Valérie Larbaud with a slightly different and perhaps more accurate assessment of Ulysses' endgame. He wrote, "I finished Ithaca last night, so that now the writing of Ulysses is ended, though I have still some weeks of work in revising the proofs." To be sure, an important phase in the composition of Ulysses had ended on or about October 30th, but even so, work on Ulysses continued almost right up to its publication on Joyce's birthday. And indeed, a similar thing happened 17 years later with Finnegan's Wake, where over a course of several months in late 1938 and early 1939, Joyce claimed at various points multiple different endpoints. I've just finished writing the book. He kept saying that because the work on Finnegan's Wake continued on and on and on. In this letter to Weaver, Joyce wonders on whose birthday Ulysses would be published. As we all know, it was published on his 40th birthday, February 2nd, 1922. However, this date was a reasonably late development in the history of its publication. Joyce and Sylvia Beach had originally planned on publishing Ulysses in the autumn of 1921, and the initial prospectuses that they sent out indicate November as the date of publication, then autumn, and then you see crossed out here, January. By September, Maurice Darentière, the printer who was tasked with producing the first edition of Ulysses, informed Joyce and Beach that due to Joyce's extensive revisions, the November date was just not going to happen. Joyce initially put the date back to January before eventually settling on his 40th birthday. And the third and final prospectus that they put out wisely doesn't list any specific publication date. At this point, it's worth noting that the exceptional circumstances around the publication of Ulysses do not just involve the errors that infected the first edition. Some of the exceptional circumstances were actually quite beneficial to Joyce and to Ulysses. Because Beach was so tolerant of Joyce, and because she had never published anything before, she was willing to pay all the extra fees Darentière required to accommodate Joyce's seemingly endless revisions on the galley and proofs. About 1/3 of Ulysses was written on the proof stages, and about 1/4 of the cost of the publication of the first edition was the surcharges that Darentière had for all this extra work. The very last revisions Joyce made were on a set of proofs dated January 30th, just days before his birthday and publication. Almost any other publisher wouldn't have let Joyce get away with such shenanigans. Had Joyce's birthday been a week or so later, the text of Ulysses would no doubt be just a little bit different. So in this case, Joyce's birthday plays a small but significant role in the shaping of the text of Ulysses. Let's look at an example of a very late addition to the text, and it's one that's about dates, the consideration of the year 1904 in Ithaca, where Joyce represents 1904 from a number of different calendrical systems. The bisextile year 1904 of the Christian era, Jewish era 5664, Mohammedan era 1322, golden number 5, epoch 13, solar cycle 9, Dominical letter CB, Roman indication 2, Julian period 6617, MXMIV. In other words, all dates are parachronistic. That is, all dates can be represented in different calendrical systems concurrently. Almost all the data in this passage derives virtually verbatim from the first page of Thom's 1904 Dublin directory. Thom's official directory of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland for the year 1904, being bisextile or leap year chronological cycles 1904, golden number 5, epoch 13, solar cycle 9, Dominical letter CB, Roman indiction 2, Julian period 6617, Jewish and Mohammedan eras. The year 5565 of the Jewish era commences on September 10th, 1904. Ramadan, month of abstinence observed by the Turks, commences on November 9, 1904. The year 1322 of the Mohammedan era commences on March 18, 1904. The only fact in the Ithaca passage, not present on the first page of Thom's, is the Roman numeral for 1904, which Joyce in fact gets wrong, as he puts in the meaningless MXMIV instead of MCMIV. While the Roman numeral doesn't appear on the first page of Tom's, it does appear on the title page where it's given as MDCCCIV, an alternate form of that year, since Roman numeration is also parachronistic. Another error in this passage is Joyce's phrase, Roman indication in place of Roman indiction. Roman indiction designates the 15-year cycle instituted by the Emperor Constantine in the year 313 for purposes of taxation. 1904 was the second year of this cycle, and therefore its Roman indiction is 2. Perhaps Joyce deliberately uses the word indication to indicate the sort of mistake that someone, such as Bloom, might make when confronted with an atypical word such as indiction. Indeed, in his Dictionary of Received Ideas, Gustave Flaubert glosses epact, golden number, Dominical letters with the less than helpful explanation, on all calendars, no one knows what they are. I didn't allow myself such editorializing when I annotated this passage. With the exception of this Roman indiction, all the other figures here are used to determine the dates of movable feasts within the Christian calendar, most particularly Easter Sunday. These terms thus indicate that our own Georgian calendar is itself parachronistic in that it incorporates and manipulates other calendrical schemes. Joyce added all this calendric information on one of the last set of page proofs for Ulysses, page proofs that were dated January 25th, 1922, so just over a week before publication, and so Joyce didn't have time to review and possibly correct this passage before publication. Therefore, perhaps these two errors with the Roman numerals and the indiction are simply unintentional gaffes. It's entirely possible that if Joyce's birthday were a bit later, giving him a little bit more time to review this passage before publication, then he might have amended it for accuracy. But then note the two separate contrafactual assumptions that underlie this proposition. Assuming that this was an unintentional error, Gobler amended the date to MCMIV and indication to indiction. But of course, these two slips could have been deliberate and might have remained even if Joyce's birthday were a tad later. In any case, with all manner of revisions such as these, it was a race around the clock for Darentière to get the first two copies of Ulysses printed and expedited to Paris by train in time for Joyce's birthday. And so when we say that Ulysses was published on Joyce's 40th birthday, all we really mean is that two copies were ready. But from Joyce's birthday onwards, Darentière was able to churn out copies at a reasonably rapid pace, unencumbered by having to deal with any further emendations. So the official publication of Joyce's birthday is actually a little bit informal. Things were a bit different with Finnegan's Wake, since Joyce was now dealing with a real publisher, Faber and Faber. And while his reputation was not inconsiderable, they were nowhere near as indulgent towards his writing practices as Beach had been with Ulysses. As with Ulysses, the plan to publish on Joyce's birthday only came about because the first planned publication dates proved to be impossible and impractical because of Joyce's revisions. Joyce initially planned to publish it on July 4th, 1938, not out of any pro-American sentiment, but rather because July 4th was his father's birthday, as well as the date he legally married Nora. But even before his revisions made this date impossible, Faber disabused him of that date, since publication during the summer holidays was not a wise business move, even for Finnegan's Wake, the prototypical Beach book. Joyce eventually finished work on Finnegan's Wake in December 1938, and Faber was able to send him an advance copy for his birthday on February 2nd, but official publication had to wait until May 4th. For his birthday party, Helen Joyce, his daughter-in-law, arranged a spectacular cake that featured replicas of Joyce's 7 books, with the Wake being given pride of place. So birthdays informed the publication schedule of Joyce's major works, but this is allowing for little leniency in calendrical exactitude. So this being 2 days late is really no big deal. So much for birthdays as markers around the publication of Joyce's works. Then what of birthdays within Joyce's works? We know that Stephen was born in 1882, like Joyce, unsurprisingly, but his exact birth date is never specified, although there is some reason to believe that it is also February 2nd. In Circe, Zoe asks Stephen on what day was he born, and he replies, Thursday, today. Both June 16, 1904 and February 2nd, 1882 were Thursdays, although pedants in the audience should now indignantly point out that the action of Circe takes place after midnight, and thus on this Friday the 17th of June, and furthermore, since there were 51 Thursdays in 1882, Stephen doesn't necessarily have to share Joyce's birthday. Now, Joyce also shared his birthday with Shakespeare's son, Hamlet. And so if Stephen shares February 2nd as well, then that common birthday would underlie Stephen's argument in Scylla and Charybdis, where Stephen is trying to imply Shakespeare as his artistic forefather. A further possible hint to Stephen's birth date comes in Aeolus, when the not entirely sober newspaper editor Miles Crawford is discussing the great Gallagher's journalistic coup in the reportage of the Phoenix Park murders. Gallagher gets many details about the murders wrong, which is entirely appropriate since, as Tom Korff writes in his book on the Phoenix Park murders, the murders are evidence riddled with doubts and untruth, vagueness and confusion, evidence which permits of no definitive account and which leaves much still hidden in mystery. Talking with Stephen, Crawford claims that the murders took place in 1881, 6th of May, time of the Invincibles, murder in the Phoenix Park, before you were born, I suppose. Now, many of the facts about the Phoenix Park murders are ambiguous and mysterious, as Korff pointed out. But the date of the murders is not ambiguous. May 6, 1882, not 1881, as Crawford claims. And so the murders actually took place shortly after Joyce, and also possibly after Stephen was born. If Stephen's birth date is the same as Joyce's, then Crawford's claim that the murders took place before he was born is right, only if the date of the murders is wrong. And of course, it is surprising that Joyce would mistake the year of a significant event in recent Irish history, especially one that coincided with his birthday. The incorrect year of the murders is repeated in Eumaeus, where it's used as a marker for Bloom's birth date, when we were told that they transpired in 1881 to be correct, when he was just turned 15. In the context of an episode like Eumaeus, and there is no other episode quite like Eumaeus, the phrase "to be correct" is an almost surefire guarantee that the fact offered is, in point of fact, incorrect. While Bloom was 15 in 1881, the murders were the following year. We know that Bloom was born in 1866, but the exact date is never specified in Ulysses, which is an interesting lacuna considering all the other things that we do know about Bloom. But I think the point here is that the murders, or more precisely an incorrect date for the murders, is used in Eumaeus as a point of reference for Bloom's age, just as an incorrect date for the murders is used in Aeolus as a point of reference for Stephen's age. Bloom and Stephen's birth dates are consociated around an incorrect date for one of the key events in the Irish political history of the late 19th century. In Ithaca, we get another mode of relating Bloom and Stephen's birth dates, this time with the question apropos Bloom and Stephen, what relation existed between their ages? One would expect the answer to be simply that Bloom is some 16 years older than Stephen. But in a wonderful and charming example of Ithacan mathematical periphrasis, we are told that, and I love this passage, 16 years before, in 1888, when Bloom was of Stephen's present age, Stephen was 6. 16 years after, in 1920, when Stephen would be of Bloom's present age, Bloom would be 54. In 1936, when Bloom would be 70 and Stephen 54, their ages, initially in the ratio of 16 to 0, would be as 17.5 to 13.5, the proportion increasing and the disparity diminishing according as arbitrary future years were added. 4. If the proportion existing in 1883 had continued immutable, conceiving that to be possible, till then 1904, when Stephen was 22, Bloom would be 374. And in 1920, when Stephen would be 38, as Bloom then was, Bloom would be 646. While in 1952, Stephen would have attained the maximum post-Diluvian age of 70, Bloom being 1,190 years alive, having been born in the year 714, would have surpassed by 221 years the maximum antediluvian age, that of Methuselah, 969 years. While if Stephen would continue continued to live until he would attain that age in the year 3072 AD, Bloom would have been obliged to have been alive 83,300 years, having been obliged to have been born in the year 81,396 BC. Phew. On an earlier draft, this passage is somewhat more blunt and is also located in a slightly different part of the episode. The question is, what did Bloom think of their different ages? And the answer is that neither could Stephen now have his age then, nor he then have Stephen's now. That is, their ages are incommensurable. This final passage makes much the same point, although makes the point through a series of extravagant calculations. As much as their ages and birth dates are mathematically manipulated, their ages remain incommensurable after all these years. That is, no matter what extrapolation is performed, Stephen and Bloom can never have the same age at the same moment in time. And this point is made by abandoning verisimilitude, as this passage admits. For if the proportion existing in 1883 had continued immutable, conceiving that to be possible. So entering the realm of the contrafactual and the realm of the purely mathematical. Bloom and Stephen's birth dates are relativized and shifted according to the caprice of Ithacan narration. The enumerations here are an exercise in calculation unencumbered by representation, and these calculations create new chronological and calendrical possibilities, and indeed this passage could continue ad infinitum as further possibilities are devised. But the passage is also somewhat unencumbered by accuracy. Even if one does not have a calculator or slide rule at one side while reading Ulysses, there is one mathematical error in this passage that should be readily apparent. A ratio of 16 to 0 would involve dividing by 0, which is something that is frowned upon by most mathematicians. Other errors are likely inadvertent and the result of Joyce not fully paying attention to the various figures that he postulates. Robert Martin Adams pointed out the error in the line. In 1952, Bloom being 1,190 years alive, having been born in the year 714. If Bloom were 1,190 years old in the year 1952, he would have to have been born in 762, not 714. Evidently, Joyce accidentally substituted 1904 for the projected year here, 1952. And as Adams also points out, the final postulates in this passage contain two additional errors. If Stephen would continue to live until he would attain that age in the year 3072 AD, Bloom would have been obliged to have been alive 83,300 years, having been obliged to have been born in the year 81,396. If Stephen were to be 1,190 years old in the year 3072, and the ratio 17 to 1, which is the proportion existing in 1883, if that proportion were to remain in effect, then Bloom would be, as you've all no doubt figured out, 20,230 years old, and thus born in 17,158 BC. Joyce appears to have accidentally substituted 70 for 17 to come up with the figure 83,300. Furthermore, he subtracted that figure, 83,300, from the current year, 1904, to yield 81,396, when he should have subtracted it from 3072. For that is the projected year when Stephen would be 1,190. All mathematical fine points. But in other words, Joyce might have been a brilliant writer, but his math skills were a bit dodgy. What I like about this passage is that it represents a flight of fancy governed only by mathematical possibility and flawed mathematical possibilities at that. Joyce's chronologies don't always match up. The parachronologies are parachronistic. If Bloom and Stephen's birth dates are a bit mobile, or made to be mobile, as we have in this passage, there are at least a few birthdays in Ulysses that are reasonably static. Millie's birthday is clear, June 15th, 1889, which in 1904 makes her, as Bloom thinks, 15 on the 15th. Rudy's birth date is likewise clear, December 29th, 1893, as is Molly's, as is given in Ithaca, September 8th, 1870. September 8th being the feast of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, that is, according to tradition, Mary's birthday. However, Molly's birthday is subject to some ambiguation, and the 1870 date was not Joyce's original choice. In a postscript to a letter to Frank Budgeon, that Cornish painter, the letter is dated August 16, 1921, Joyce states, Molly Bloom was born in 1871. Although evidently Joyce changed his mind about this, and indeed on one of his notes for Penelope, Joyce writes, M.B. mistakes her age. So Joyce translates his initial indecision about Molly's age to Molly's own mistakes about her birth date. In Penelope, Molly expresses some confusion over the year of her birth. 4 years more I have of life up to 35. No, what am I at all? I'll be 33 in September. In point of fact, if one can speak of facts apropos fictional characters, Molly will be 34 in September 1904. Therefore, she mistakenly makes 1871 as her year of birth. And also notice how Molly uses a common colloquial expression of ontologically equating herself with her age. No, what am I at all? If Molly makes herself a bit younger, then she also makes Stephen a bit older, thereby diminishing the difference between their respective ages, thereby making a dalliance more plausible. I suppose he's 20 or more. I'm not too old for him if he's 23 or 24. So it's not just Ithacan narrators and drunken newspaper editors and Joyce's dodgy maths that alter and adapt Stephen's birth date. The confusion Molly has over her birth date was one that was shared by Nora. Church and state records disagree as to whether the date of her birth was March 21st or 22nd in 1884. So then there's a nice irony that the two then masters of Ireland, the Italian and the British, disagreed over her birth date. In any case, the confusion was either abetted or aggravated when Joyce and Nora moved to Switzerland in 1916, and her birth date became, through bureaucratic fiat, March 25th, 1886. Swiss neutrality intervenes to resolve the discord between church and state. If Nora's birth date is not quite fixed, Joyce ascribed a certain talismanic power to his own birth date, an example of which can be seen in the curious case of James Stephens and Finnegan's Wake. In 1927, exhausted by writing Finnegan's Wake, Joyce toyed with the idea of abdicating his authorship in favor of James Stephens. His rationale for choosing Stephens, we knew only briefly, his rationale for choosing Stephens depended upon a number of small coincidences. Stephen's name combines with Joyce's Christian name. Stephen's name combines Joyce's Christian name with the Christian name of his protagonist in a portrait, and he shared Joyce's birthday, February 2nd, 1882. And like Joyce, Stephens had two children, a boy and a girl. Joyce also noted that their combined authorship would yield the lettering J, J, and S, James's, Joyce, and Stephens, which is a nice allusion to Jameson's whiskey. However, except for the Jamesons, always except for the Jamesons, the connections between Joyce and Stephens are illusory. While Stephens did have two children, the daughter was actually his wife's child from a previous marriage, and Stephens was adopted, so James Stephens wasn't his real name, and he never knew his real birthday. February 2nd, 1882 was just a date that had been chosen at random, and indeed he wasn't particularly attached to it, and on various forms during his life used other dates seemingly at random. Stephens was somewhat bemused by Joyce's proposal to take on authorship of The Wake. Recalling this whole business later, Stephens wrote, "Well, I was astonished. I was admired at last. Joyce admired me. I was beloved at last. Joyce loved me." Or did he? Or did he only love his birthday, and was I merely coincident to that? So, like the man in the Macintosh for Bloom, James Stephens is a self-involved enigma for Joyce that is a weird reflection for himself, a weird reflection which only he can see. Fortunately for Stephens, Joyce's planned abdication of writing The Wake never came about, even though it does seem that he was reasonably serious about it for a time in the late 20s and early 30s. In any case, it seems from Joyce's mania for Stephens that the only thing that one needs to be able to write Finnegan's Wake is to have been born on February 2nd, 1882. One of the few explicit references to February 2nd in Joyce's works comes in chapter 2.1 of Finnegan's Wake, when the Maggies sing and dance around Chuff. He's not going to Cork till Candlemas, or may hope till Rose Easter or St. Tybalt's Day. This plays off the Dublin variant of the children's street rhyme, how many miles to Babylon? How many miles to Barney Bridge? 70 will I be there by Candlemas? Yes, and back again. This and other children's rhymes leads directly into one of several instantiations of the so-called Quinet sentence in Finnegan's Wake. This is a sentence from Edgar Quinet's book Introduction à la philosophie de l'histoire de l'humanité, a sentence that Joyce called beautiful. This sentence appears 6 times with variations in the Wake. Chronologically, the Quinet sentence in 2.2, just after this line about Candlemas, was the 3rd Quinet passage to be installed in the Wake. Since the days of Romulus and Regimus, the Pavanos have been strident through their struts of Chapel-Dissett. The Volseys have mead and yodeled through the pearly ooze of Ballybough. Many a mizmai cloud has stripped daintily along the Her-Court Strayed railway, and the Rigadoons have held ragtimed revels on their plotaplain of Grange-Gorman. And though since then sterlings and guineas have been replaced by brooks and lions, and some progress has been made on stilts, and the races have come and gone, and time, that chief of seasoners, has made as usual astute use of the endanjustables, and what not will be is nor was, those dancedills and the cancanzanis have come stimmering down for our bigament through the bedaffaloom of Poe's Teorms, the obesity of Pa's tippucks, as lithe as limb-free limber, as when mummy mummed at ma. As with Joyce's other versions of the Quinet sentence, the temporal markers at the beginning, the temporal marker is altered. Instead of Quinet's Pliny and Columella, Joyce has Romulus and Remus. That is, instead of Quinet's ancient historians, Joyce posits mythological founders. Furthermore, Quinet's flowers have become dances, pavan, valses, and rigadoons, and so on and so forth, and which is an appropriate metamorphosis for this chapter in which the Maggies dance around Chuff as he attempts to guess their color. The point here seems to be that the dance endures through decay and entropy, much as children's games have lasted throughout history. Children's games are, on the one hand, fleeting. By definition, one usually grows out of them. On the other hand, children's games have persisted throughout the ages. Individual players may grow up, but the individual players will always be replaced by subsequent generations, thereby allowing for a continuation and perpetuation of the games. Children's games are thus parachronistic in that they occupy 2 temporal schemes. One is personal and transient, and the other is eternal. The Wakean Quinet sentence in general, the Wakean Quinet sentences in general, but this one in 2.2 in particular, seem to say something about the phenomenology of birthdays, especially since birthdays are something one looks forward to as a child and dread as an adult. The ritual of celebrating birthdays continues long past the lifetime of any one individual. Indeed, here we are celebrating the birthday of someone long dead. And so a birthday celebration consociates the specific and particular with the universal. Everyone has a birthday. This one happens to be mine. It's not just birthdays that are parachronistic, but rather the individuals who celebrate them are parachronistic. We all occupy multiple calendars, multiple chronologies, and multiple perspectives. The birthday just indicates the link between the individual and the species, or as we have in the Wake, an imaginable itinerary through the particular universal. The birthday is our particular universal. Individuals may come and go, but life is always the same anew. Here comes and goes everybody. To conclude, I'd like to read from a letter John Stanislaus Joyce wrote to his son in January 1931. My dear Jim, I wish you a very happy birthday and also a bright and happy New Year. I wonder, do you recollect the old days in Brighton Square when you were baby Taku and I used to take you out in the square and tell you about the moo cow that used to come down from the mountain and take little boys across? This letter shows that the opening scene in a portrait is deeply autobiographical. And it also shows that John Stanislaus Joyce never read any of his son's novels, not even the first page. Thank you.
and the